Thanks everybody for coming. Really good to see so many people here. I want to talk about the movie Spotlight. How many have seen it? Oh, that's fantastic. That's great. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my career because I guess many of you are hoping to actually graduate. So I want to try to inspire you about the future as well. So I think by now you all know that the movie won a couple of Academy Awards. It won the award for Best Original Screenplay, and it won the award for Best Picture, which is an amazing accomplishment in and of itself. What's even more amazing is this movie really gets it right. And what I mean by that is this is a tremendous depiction of how skilled reporters do their job and tackle big stories. So it's actually a great lesson in journalism. So I want to talk a little bit about the investigation that led to the movie, our investigation of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And then I want to talk about how the movie got made, against all odds, I should say. And then I want to talk about a couple of other subjects that are very important to me, and I'd like to think they're important to you. And one is the state of investigative reporting today, and the other is clergy sexual abuse, and what the Boston Archdiocese and the Vatican are doing about it or not doing about it. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I was a BU grad, and I was an English major, not a journalism major, but at BU there is a journalism department. And I took some journalism courses. And as part of an assignment in my junior year, I volunteered to do a little work for a neighborhood newspaper called the East Boston Community News. And on a volunteer basis, I wrote an actual story that they actually published to my shock and amazement. And then one thing led to another, and I wrote story after story. And after a couple years of that, I graduated. And upon graduation, the paper offered me the job of editor for the grand salary of about $150 a week, which I thought was a small fortune at the time. And then I went on to work for the Boston Phoenix. You may remember that. And I went out to California, and I worked for the San Jose Mercury News. Then I worked for the Washington Post, and of course then I came back home to Boston and worked for the Boston Globe. And today I'm still fighting the good fight with my colleagues on the Globe Spotlight team, which not only still exists, but is even bigger today than it was back in 2001. So first about the story that we did that led to this movie. I like to tell people, first of all, that the Boston Globe Spotlight team did not discover clergy sexual abuse. There was a number of scandals around the country before we came along, and there was a lot of very good journalism. There was a scandal in Louisiana. This was the case of Father Gilbert Gauthier. There was a lot of great reporting about that. There was a scandal in Texas, in Dallas. There was a serial clergy abuser by the name of Rudy Koss, and a lot of great journalism about that. And in the early 90s, right here in Massachusetts, there was a scandal down in Fall River, the neighboring diocese, where a priest by the name of Father James Porter was accused of molesting more than 100 children. And the Globe covered that story very well and wrote probably hundreds of stories about it. So why was our work different, and why did it have such incredible impact? Well, there were two things I would say that made our work very, very different than anything that had come before. And the first is that we proved that there was a cover-up of clergy sex abuse, that these were not just a few bad apples, as cardinal law and the Catholic Church wanted everyone to believe. We proved that this was a cover-up of a systemic problem. Specifically, we proved that cardinal law knew that a priest by the name of Father John Geoghegan had been molesting children throughout his career over 30 years in 6 different parishes, and yet continued to assign him to new churches where Father John Geoghegan continued to molest more children. The second thing we did was we got into the scope of the problem. We proved that the problem was far broader and far deeper than anyone had imagined. So those two things really distinguished our work and really resulted in kind of an earthquake that started in Boston and spread across the country and around the world. Clergy sex abuse is still a very, very alive issue 15 years later. Right now, Australia is engulfed in scandal. Scandal has moved from country to country to country. So it's still important that journalists cover it. So how did it begin? How did it all happen? As you see in the movie, it would never have happened without Marty Baron. Marty Baron was the newly minted editor of the Globe at the time. Today he's the editor of the Washington Post. And people can't believe it. They think it's a dramatization, but it's really true that on Marty Baron's first day of work, he walked into the door at Morrissey Boulevard. He read a column by a wonderful fire-breathing columnist named Eileen McNamara, who I miss very much. She teaches at Brandeis today. And Eileen wrote the story about an attorney who was representing victims of Father John Geoghegan, and he had filed a series of lawsuits against the church, 84 lawsuits. And Eileen wrote that all the church documents that had been turned over in the course of this litigation were impounded, that a judge had ordered all these records sealed. In other words, only the lawyers for the church and the victims could see these records. The public could not see them. This is not the way justice is supposed to work in America. What guarantees our system of fair justice is openness and transparency. But these records were being impounded and kept secret. So Eileen wrote in her columns that because of the impoundment order, the truth may never be known. And I think for Marty, those words were a red flag. Marty, who has impeccable journalistic values, believes that it is the duty of a journalist to find the truth and not accept those who say that the truth should be covered up. So Marty wanted to explore filing a court motion to challenge the confidentiality order, which I think a lot of editors at the Globe found shocking. No one had ever thought to challenge the Catholic Church in the city of Boston. At that time, the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in the city and the state. But Marty decided he would have the Globe lawyers explore the possibility of challenging this motion and try to figure out whether we would have a good shot at overturning it or not. The second thing he did was he asked the Globe Spotlight team to start looking into the case of Father John Geoghegan. So we on the Spotlight team were a little bit daunted by this prospect, perhaps a little bit excited by getting involved in what we thought was probably going to be a pretty big story. And we quickly found out that we were dealing with not just one priest, but probably several. We fanned out across the city, we talked to our sources, and we realized that, wow, this was just not one priest, but there might be a half a dozen. And then we came to believe there might be as many as a dozen. And we thought that was pretty mind-blowing. But of course, today we know the number is 250. 250 priests accused of molesting children only in the Boston Archdiocese since 1950, which is, at the time, just incredibly shocking. So we started a two-track process. One track was to determine how widespread the problem was, and the other track was to find out as much about John Geoghegan as we could. And I became the Geoghegan guy. And it was my job, first of all, to get to know the lawyer who was representing the victims. And as you saw in the movie, Mitch Garabedian, and he's a pal of mine, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind my saying this, but he is a fairly difficult man to get to know. I started calling him my cross to bear. It was almost impossible to get him to even have a brief conversation with me, never mind get to the bottom of what he knew and get to the stories of his clients, the victims and survivors of abuse. But that was the key. I ended up winning his trust by spending a lot of time with his clients, victims of clergy sex abuse. And I spent week after week in Mitch's office, without Mitchell present, talking to his clients in what were often very, very emotional sessions about the abuse these people had suffered as children. And as a result, I did win Mitchell's trust. I think he also understood that this was not just a one-shot deal. I was not just writing one story. Once I told him that the Spotlight team was interested, I think he began to have confidence for the first time that he was not alone in his fight. The church had tried to have Mitchell disbarred on a number of occasions, so I think he was worried about losing his ability to make a living. But after he trusted me and understood that the Globe was committed to this story in the long haul, he became more comfortable. And he told me that through a fairly ingenious legal strategy, he had managed to get some of the most explosive sealed documents in 14 of the lawsuits that he had filed. The problem was that those records had disappeared. Someone cleaned them out of files. They were supposed to be publicly available, but they were no longer publicly available. In any event, I was able to get those documents. And how I got them is perhaps a story for another day, but I was able to get them. And the documents showed, without any doubt, that there was a cover-up of clergy sex abuse in Boston. And I'll tell you what a couple of those documents were. One was a letter written to Cardinal Law by one of his top bishops, Bishop John Darcy. And John Darcy said, in black and white, "Why are we assigning Father John Geoghegan to another parish? He has," and I'm quoting him now pretty much, he said, "Father John Geoghegan has a history of homosexual involvement with young boys, and there are complaints about him everywhere he's been." Father John Darcy's words of caution were the documents also included some very poignant letters by a woman by the name of Marge Gallant. Marge Gallant was a devout Catholic who loved her church, and she was complaining in these letters not only to Cardinal Law, but his predecessor, Cardinal Umberto Medeiros, that Father John Geoghegan had molested 7 boys in her own extended family, and she had been assured repeatedly that something would be done about it. And yet, as she was walking around her neighborhood, there was Father John Geoghegan inviting young children out to have ice cream with him. So these letters were especially moving because they pointed out the crimes of Father John Geoghegan. After all, sexual assault on a child is a crime. And also her love of the church, incredibly poignant. In any case, the documents did prove that there was a cover-up. At about the same time, we did challenge the confidentiality order, sealing all of the records in the John Geoghegan lawsuits, and we won. So at that point, we learned we would be getting these documents, that they would amount to about 10,000 pages of records just about complaints of sexual abuse against one priest. Furthermore, we were also making a lot of headway in our reporting about the scope of the problem, and we were discovering that it wasn't just 6 or 12, that it was dozens. So we had some very, very explosive information, and in January of 2002, we published 4 blockbuster stories. The first story was January 6, 2002, and that was the story about the cover-up, about Cardinal Law's knowledge of Father John Geoghegan's predations on children over 30 years and his decision to allow him to continue working as a priest, endangering more children. The second story was quite interesting. We were able to get John Geoghegan's psychiatric records. He'd been treated many times at a variety of institutions. And we learned from these psychiatric records, and also from our own interviews, that there was an MO here, that what Father Geoghegan did is he targeted children who were living in broken families. In other words, he targeted children in families that were typically headed by a single mother without much money, struggling to raise 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 children. A mother who would be very, very grateful for the assistance of a priest and very flattered by the attention of a priest. So the third story was about all of the 10,000 pages of records in the Geoghegan case. And I think the big takeaway there was, in situation after situation, there would be complaints about Father John Geoghegan. He would be sent somewhere for treatment, and then he would be brought back and assigned to another parish. And we found these letters from Cardinal Law to Father Geoghegan, and from other bishops as well. And the letters all said something to the effect of, "Dear Jack, we're so grateful for your service, so grateful for your ministry. It's too bad you've experienced this bump in the road in your career, but really happy to have you back." So there was a tremendous amount of compassion shown to Father John Geoghegan, and no compassion shown to his victims, none, no acknowledgement of the plight of his victims at all, which we found quite shocking. And the fourth story was about the scope of the problem, and we reported that as many as 70 priests in the Boston Archdiocese had been accused of molesting children. And this caused an earthquake. I think the first story about the cover-up, the final story about the 70 priests was like a double blast from a journalistic shotgun, and the story literally exploded. And we added 4 more reporters. Eventually, we got the records of all the priests who had been accused of sexual abuse in the Boston Archdiocese. And we expanded from 4 reporters to 8 reporters, as I said, and we published over the course of a year an additional 600 articles. So we were writing stories about sexual abuse by priests every day, and it was an incredible amount of work. I never knew I was capable of working that hard. And we wrote a book about our reporting in the middle of all this. So there were weeks where I was working 5 days a week. I would get up in the morning, I would go to the courthouse, I would pick up some records, I'd get to the Globe, I'd write a page 1 story, I'd be there till 9 or 10 o'clock answering questions from editors. Then I would maybe have a drink and something to eat and go to bed. And I would do it again the next day. And when Saturday rolled around, I'd work on the book. And when Sunday rolled around, I was still working on the book. And when Monday rolled around, I was back at the courthouse. And that went on week after week after week. So it was an incredible commitment on the part of all of us on the Spotlight team. So we wrote our 600 stories, and finally, on December 13th of 2002, Cardinal Law resigned as the Archbishop of Boston, and he fled to the Vatican. And I say fled because there were 2 grand juries that were investigating him at that point. It was both a state grand jury and a federal grand jury. But that was the last we heard of Cardinal Law in the Boston Archdiocese. So the question is, I guess, how does this become a movie? And even though we won a number of journalism prizes, we won the Pulitzer Prize for public service, it never crossed our minds that our work could become a Hollywood movie. I mean, if you think about it, what do? We read old musty court documents at our desks, we talk on the phone, we walk around on the street and get doors slammed in our faces, and we sit around and talk. You think that's a cinematic movie? I would say good luck to you. I mean, you know, we don't carry guns, there are no car chases, I've never seen an explosion. How could this possibly be a movie? It never crossed our minds. But somebody else thought it might be a movie, and this somebody else was a guy named David Meisner who wrote a case study about our work for the Columbia Journalism School. I don't know if you're familiar with the case study method of education. It's been made very popular by the Harvard Business School. And briefly, it works something like this. Instead of studying accounting or advertising, what will happen at the Harvard Business School is they will get a summary, a narrative description of an actual crisis faced by a business, and the students will have to figure out what the solution is. So Columbia Journalism School started doing the same thing in their graduate program, and somebody wrote a case study, this man David Meisner, about our investigation. He spent a lot of time with us trying to get it right. As you can see, it was very, very complicated what we did. And he wrote the story, and he also got into the relationship between the church and the city of Boston, which was quite complicated as well. It was not a good relationship because of issues such as abortion and contraception and women in the priesthood. So it was a difficult relationship. And he, at the same time, there were many, many ardent, devoted Catholics in the city, and David was able to capture that complexity in the case study that he wrote, and when he was finished, he asked me to go over it with him and find the little small factual errors that you always encounter in a piece of writing that's about 30 pages long, which is what he produced. And he said to me sort of offhandedly, you know, this would make a great movie. And I said, not on your life, I mean, come on, we're just, you know, all the big moments, we're sitting at our desks. And he said, no, trust me, it'll make a good movie. And he was a novelist, and one of his novels had been optioned by a couple of Hollywood producers. And he said, do you mind if I tell them about this? So I talked to my colleagues on the Spotlight team, and we all decided, hey, why not? So shortly thereafter, we were approached by a couple of young, inexperienced producers, and they pitched this project to us as a movie about the importance and value of journalism at a time when journalism is really being seriously challenged financially, to the point where some people think journalism as we know it may no longer exist in the near future. And so we thought that was a pretty good idea. We thought there would be some public good to a project like that if it ever happened. But we never thought it would happen. Still, we never thought it would happen. And finally, after a couple of years, when we heard very little or nothing, these two producers took the project to a company called Anonymous Content, and Anonymous Content paid for a director and a screenwriter to get on board. And the director Tom McCarthy and the screenwriter Josh Singer, who would win the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, they decided to collaborate. And they came to Boston and they spent hours and hours and weeks and literally months and months talking to us on the Spotlight team. I remember driving Tom and Josh all around the city of Boston, showing them the neighborhoods where Father John Gagan worked and preyed upon children. I took them to the mansion where Cardinal Law lived. I took them to the cathedral down on Washington Street. Really tried to give them a sense of Boston. I took them to Santarpio's Pizza in East Boston, which shows up in the movie because they really liked the place. And they just worked very, very hard at producing a document that was really authentic. And even after they wrote the first draft of the screenplay, they sent it to us. And myself and my boss, Walter Robinson, and Tom and Josh, we sat in a room at the Boston Globe and we went over the script line by line for 11 hours. And we were talking to them about just the plausibility of some of the scenes where they had used a little dramatization. We even got down to specific word choice by certain characters. And that is really a testament to Tom and Josh and how much they were simply devoted to producing an authentic document, which they did. After the script was produced, it still had trouble getting made. It still had trouble attracting financing. In fact, in Los Angeles, all the insiders out there, every year they have a vote for the best unproduced screenplay. And that's what Spotlight got. So again, we thought, geez, it's too, it's not a superhero movie. There's no car chases, explosions. It'll never happen. And then a guy named Mark Ruffalo came along. And Mark read the script and he loved it. And Mark is a very principled man. I don't know if you've seen his work in defense of clean water. He's out in Flint, Michigan right now. But he's a very principled guy, very dedicated to a number of political causes. And he liked the idea of making a movie about the issue of clergy sex abuse. He thought the timing might be very good because we have a relatively new Pope, Pope Francis, who seems to want to change things. So he thought, plus he thought it was just an exciting, thrilling piece of writing. It's not didactic or preachy or any of that. So Mark Ruffalo signed on, and because Mark is also a very engaging, warm, generous, big-hearted, fun guy, everybody else signed on. Everybody in the industry, I learned, wants to work with Mark. And so in very short order, Michael Keaton and Stanley Tucci and Rachel McAdams, John Slattery, Brian Darcy James, this incredibly talented cast of people all of a sudden appeared and became very devoted to this project. They were paid much, much less than they are normally paid. They were excited, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, they were very excited to play the roles of people who were still alive, that they could actually talk to and study. And I think they were also excited about doing a movie that really means something, that really has changed the world. I think they felt very, very excited about that. So the movie gets made, and we saw a rough cut. It was a very emotional experience. I can't say those years were the happiest time of my life. And on the other hand, it was very validating to see this picture, and we thought that it might actually give our work a second life. So we were very happy with it, even though I think it was emotionally overwhelming. And still I thought, hey, this movie, really great. It's probably be one of these movies that opens up at the Kendall Cinema over in Cambridge and plays for a couple of weeks and slips under the waves, never to be heard from again. But no. People loved this movie, and they just loved it and loved it and loved it. And it opened in November, and it was still playing. It's still playing now, I think. And so here we are, where it gets 2 Academy Awards, Best Original Screenplay, and amazingly, Best Picture. And it's really a thrill and very, very rewarding. I think the most rewarding part of it is all the survivors of clergy sex abuse. They love this movie because it validates their story. These survivors, they have been ignored for decades, centuries, and they feel validated. And I think the movie has brought some justice to them. The movie has also given our work, as we hoped, a second life, and more survivors are coming forward all the time, and I think more pressure is being put on the church, and I think that's a good thing. So that brings me to the state of journalism today. and what's happening with clergy sex abuse 15 years after we published our stories. And I will say that Cardinal Sean O'Malley has taken some very exemplary measures to prevent child sex abuse within the Boston Archdiocese. Just a few examples. Anyone who works for the Boston Archdiocese and is also going to work with children has to undergo a police background check. There are awareness classes for both children and adults in the Archdiocese to help them recognize sexual predators who may be in their midst. And at the Vatican level, this new Pope, Pope Francis, has established a commission to study the issue, and he's placed Cardinal Sean O'Malley at the head of it. And he's also established a commission that is supposed to hold bishops accountable, bishops who cover up for priests who abuse children. But the reality is that other dioceses have not followed Cardinal Sean O'Malley's lead. I mean, it would be a wonderful thing if every diocese in America, and at this point, perhaps more importantly, every diocese in the world, followed his lead and instituted the same measures that he has, but that has not happened. And at the Vatican, I think all the survivors would say, and I would agree, that, hey, it's 15 years since the Globe published their stories. Perhaps the time for study is over and the time for concrete action has arrived. In addition, the tribunal that is supposed to hold bishops accountable has not done very much. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with journalists. It's really up to journalists to hold their local diocese accountable for the measures they're taking to protect children. It's really up to journalists to hold the Vatican accountable for taking measures that'll prevent clergy sex abuse around the world. And without journalism, without the spotlight of journalism, I have to say, I think things will just go along and not get very much better. And I think that's true for all of our public and private and nonprofit institutions. When you think about it, it's only journalists that hold powerful institutions and powerful people accountable for what they do and what they say. And without journalism, I don't think our democracy or any democracy can work. Without an informed citizenry, democracy doesn't function, and it's only through journalism that we have an informed citizenry. So with that, I will just say I hope to inspire you to support good journalism, either by subscribing to your favorite newspaper or news organization, or making a donation to your favorite online news organization that might be using the nonprofit model, which is becoming more and more popular in organizations like ProPublica or the Center for Investigative Reporting. So really, it's up to you, and in this room, it's a special circumstance because you not only have the option of subscribing to an important news organization, but you have the option to pursue a very noble career, and that's journalism. Thanks very much.
So packed. It's just great to have you all here. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and I know Michael's eager to respond to them. So who would like to begin?
So I know in the movie there is a scene about how 9/11 really interrupted the investigation. What sort of advice would you give to aspiring journalists about dealing with something big happen right in the middle of the investigation and having to put sort of the one you're working on aside?
Well, you hope to work for a sympathetic editor who will understand the importance of the long-term project you're working on. I mean, one of the benefits of working on the Spotlight team is theoretically we're supposed to be given long, uninterrupted periods of time to do this sort of investigation. But 9/11 was just a gargantuan event, and it was clear to all of us that we're going to have to put our work aside to cover 9/11. And that just happens. I mean, you know, you work for a news organization, and obviously you don't control the news happens to you. Hopefully you're working for an organization that appreciates the importance of the long-term project that can see the day when that is published and it really has a big impact. At the same time, you know, every news organization is going to have an obligation to cover important news events, and you know, it's tough. It's not always an easy thing to pull off. The key here is with having really good editors.
question.
Sure.
How did the name Spotlight even come about for the Boston Globe? I know I've been hearing about it through the movie and stuff. I was just wondering how it came about.
You know, that's a very good question. The Spotlight team was modeled after an investigative team at the LA Times. I'm sorry, the London Times. And the Globe used to have an exchange program with the London Times in the early 70s. It was that long ago. And the London Times had an investigative unit called the Insight Team. And a reporter came back from London and said, hey, they got this great thing at the London Times called the Insight Team. We should do something similar. And I don't know who came up with the term Spotlight, but that's its genesis.
I was just wondering more about like your background and your life story, if you'd like to share some of that.
Well, I think I've told you my educational background. I mean, I come from a Catholic family. I'm Portuguese on my father's side, French Canadian on my mother's side. So I was a regular churchgoer until probably my late teens. My sister went to Catholic school, so it was a very Catholic family. So I think that proved to be beneficial to my reporting. I think it gave me a lot of insights into how people related to the Catholic Church. It gave me a lot of insight into the incredible deference people had toward the Catholic Church. I mean, people who were not Catholic would come up to me and others on the Spotlight team and say, hey, how could a mother ever leave her children alone with a priest? But we knew, we were all raised Catholic, as it turns out. We didn't know that when we first assembled as a team, but we knew that the priest was the one person in the community you would entrust with your children. He was the most trusted person in the community by far. So we understood that intuitively and did not have to waste a lot of time trying to figure it out. So I think my Catholicism helped in my reporting.
Was there any time where you felt like you were really over your head, and like how did you guys get past that during the story?
Well, that's a good question. Often during some investigations, I do feel like the learning curve is very steep. As I said, in this case, it was a bit unique because we were all Catholics, and I guess the learning curve was steep in a different sort of way. For instance, it was just really hard to understand how so much sexual abuse could be taking place within an organization that purported to be the most moral institution in the community. How could this possibly be? And what we did was we had, as we often do, what I call a guru. In the movie you see, we talk with a man over the phone named Richard Sipe. In reality, we met with him extensively. And Richard Sipe was a former priest who also had a lot of expertise. He was also a psychologist and a psychotherapist. And he had not only been treating abusive priests and victims of clergy sex abuse in his practice, but he had also conducted a number of academic studies. And he was the one who essentially was able to articulate the culture of secrecy within the clergy that perpetuates child sexual abuse. And his explanation helped us a lot. And he ended up being sort of a guide for us throughout the project. And often when I do investigative projects, I'm looking for someone like that, someone who knows the system that I'm investigating from the inside and can really tell me how it works. So it's really, you're looking for people who can help you, and there almost always is someone who can help. Right here.
So in the movie, there's a scene when you guys all meet with one of the victims. He brings like a box of like books and papers and all that. And in the movie, he says he sent it all to you guys, and no one seemed to know anything about it. Do you guys know what actually happened to that stuff and like where it went? And have you ever actually seen it?
Yeah, I do know what happened to the stuff, and one of the things that makes this such a great movie is that it explores the Globe's own complicity in the cover-up. And I think that is very, very powerful, and I think it's a credit to the Globe that everyone there understands this. You know, the secret of clergy sex abuse was a secret held by very many. Law enforcement knew, did nothing. The judicial system knew, did nothing. Business leaders knew, did nothing. Lawyers knew, a lot of people knew. And yet nothing happened until Marty Baron came along and put the Spotlight team on the story. You know, we covered the Porter case in the early 90s, and we covered it very well, and we wrote many, many, many stories. But at the end of the day, this Ben Bradley, who was the supervising editor at the time, he said that we were just not advancing the story. It was the same story over and over again. And so he decided that we needed to move on to something else. The thing that made our story so different, as I said, is we got the internal church documents that proved the cover-up. And that took the story to a whole other level. But I guess, you know, I guess you could say that the Globe was remiss in not covering the story earlier, but I will say this as well. We now know that this problem existed in every major city in the country. There have been clergy abuse scandals now in every major city in America, and every major city in America has a major newspaper. And no one wrote the story, no one investigated the story until we came along.
The movie shows an emotional strain. The movie shows like an emotional strain on the reporters when they're trying to get the stories from the victims. So was there ever a time you had to take a step back because it was so heavy?
Well, it was pretty heavy, and it's not easy to sit and listen to people tell stories about how their lives have essentially been ruined by sexual abuse during childhood. We heard scores of stories like that. We became inevitably, I think, close to many of the victims. Many of them were telling us their stories of abuse for the first time. There was a lot of sometimes crying and yelling, and it was a burden, I guess. I don't think we ever stopped. I think what happened is the sadness that we felt on behalf of the survivors was converted into anger. And I think we were just appalled at what had happened to so many people, and it made us very, very determined to get to the truth. At the end of it, Walter Robinson's wife is a nurse, and at the end of it, she took a look at us and said, "You all have PSD." And maybe we did. But it was hard. I won't kid you. It was hard.
So there's a point in the story where Sasha is showing her grandmother the first article, I believe. And I just want to know from your perspective and hers and everyone else's how the Catholicism really strained in your personal lives.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly poignant movie. Maybe the saddest moment in the movie. You know, it is a strain. I mean, you know, I have one of my Catholic cousins said to me, "You know, it's a great movie and you guys did great work, but I'm really happy my mother and father are dead. I don't have to read this." And I had a cousin who was getting married in the Catholic Church just at the time I was breaking the stories, and she let me know that she did not appreciate the work at all. So I think it was a strain for all of us in one way or another. No doubt about it. That was the sort of the price we paid, I guess. I'd love to get some people in the back. Can I just call on people without a mic? How about way all the way in the back?
Was there ever a time that the Globe was going to buckle to political or religious pressure over this story?
No, there was never a moment where we came even close to buckling or pulling back. That is a great credit to Marty Baron, the editor, and Richard Gilman, who was the publisher representing the New York Times. We never had a moment like that. After I got the documents that proved there was a cover-up, these were the documents that were impounded that Mitch Garabedian was able to put into the public file. After I got those documents and we started doing interviews based on those documents, the church threatened to sue us, but we never took them seriously at all. I mean, the lawsuit wouldn't have worked. This is you can't stop a story before it's published. It's called prior restraint. It was all litigated during the Pentagon Papers case. So it was an empty threat, and we saw it as an empty threat. At the same time, we also have very good lawyers at the Globe, and so we just didn't pay any attention to the threat at all, except to note it. And we never hesitated. There was never any fear, at least that was communicated to me. And the sweater all the way back. No, that's you. Yep.
Do you know if there have been many studies done as to why this has happened in the Catholic Church? Is Is it something about the church that was a catalyst for it? Is it the people that go into the priesthood? Is it, you know, that you have to be celibate? Is anybody really studying this in depth?
Well, I'll say a couple of things about it. One is it needs a lot more study, but yes, some studies have been done. And I mentioned Richard Sipe earlier, and if I can just take a minute to explain the dynamic that he has written about in several books, it's this. Priests are not allowed to have sex of any kind, but priests are human beings, and human beings have sex. So of course many priests are having sex, maybe as many as half, probably more than half. And some of those priests are having sex with women, and some of those priests are having sex with men, and probably a much smaller percentage are having sex with children. But in the eyes of the church, all of that sex is illegal. So they all have an interest in covering up for one another. In other words, a priest who's having sex with a man or a woman isn't going to want to report on a priest who's having sex with a child, because that priest could report on the priest who's having sex with a man or a woman. So it is a culture of secrecy. It's a little bit like I have felt sometimes covering any other institution where the first instinct is to protect one another, protect the institution. You also raise some other issues that I think warrant study. For instance, are people with sexual disorders attracted to the clergy? And I think there is some evidence for that. I can't cite you any studies, but you know, just informally, I think in the 1940s and the 1950s, if there was a big family and you know, maybe one of the boys showed signs of being gay, I think unfortunately that family would try to steer that person into the church, which probably ended up being a disaster for all involved. So celibacy may have something to do with it. I think the requirement of celibacy has something to do with it. I'm not sure celibacy itself has anything to do with it, but these are all matters that could use substantially more study. Sure, right here. Oh. Sorry, we're not working that well together. I'll keep my eye on you next time.
So I'm an alum who was invited back to hear you speak, and I'm very thankful that I was invited back now. I've been working as a journalist for the past 2.5 years, and I cover high school sports because I like working with the student athletes and their families and highlighting their accomplishments. But I also do have interest and passion for the type of journalism that you provide, the public service. And in today's kind of digital-first media outlets and the wave of digital journalism that we see, you know, mainly websites kind of in the mainstream, you know, their business model, it's all encircled around how many hits or clicks or page views can a website get, just to kind of hit on the trending topics to get as much ad revenue to boost revenue. And my question for you is, how do you feel that mindset of not how well but how much, how do you feel that hinders the investigative reporting process, and what can your type of journalism do to adapt to that changing mindset?
Yeah, I think it's a very troubling trend, but I think also what we're seeing is a lot of short-sightedness on the part of editors who are under probably too much pressure to turn a profit too soon. In other words, I think I said earlier that the Spotlight team is bigger now than it was in 2001. And we have, at the Globe, have faced the same financial challenges as other media organizations. Our staff is a lot smaller than it used to be. We've closed all our foreign bureaus. We've closed all our national bureaus except for Washington. We've had buyout after buyout, and we've had layoffs. But our Spotlight team is bigger, and there are two reasons for that. One is, of course, it's the right thing to do. Investigative reporting fulfills our responsibility under the First Amendment, but also it's business savvy. We do readership surveys, and what do we find? We find that people love the Spotlight team. We find that people subscribe to the Globe because of the Spotlight team. Find that people really want investigative reporting. People really want information about their public officials and the big businesses in town. So I think editors who ignore investigative reporting or cut their investigative staffs, it's a situation of being penny wise and pound foolish. They'll save some money year one, but in years 2, 3, or 4, I think they'll find that their readers or viewers will desert them because they're not getting the meat on the bone that they're looking for. You know, recently, after the Academy Award for Globe Spotlight, the top trending story on the Boston Globe website was the story I wrote about John Gagin on January 6th in 2002. And it was the top trending story for several days. So I think editors have to understand that when they make that investment in an investigative story and it's finally published, they're going to get a lot of traction out of it. They're going to get a lot of clicks. But I don't mean to brush aside what you're saying. I think there are some very, very serious challenges posed to investigative reporting today. It's almost a crisis. So I don't mean to brush aside what you're saying. I think it needs to be thought about and addressed in a really substantive way. One of the responses has been to get rid of investigative reporting as a business, get rid of that notion, and run it as a nonprofit organization. And as I said, you see places like ProPublica, the Center for Public Integrity, and many other small websites springing up around the country to do this kind of journalism based on donations rather than revenue. Whether it works or not remains to be seen. I always like a good business model because I think making a profit gives you independence. But we are in a period of transition here. Like I say, it's virtually a crisis, and I don't think anyone knows how it's going to play out. But I think it's very important for all of us to support good watchdog journalism.
We have time for one more question.
Wow. I'm sorry for speaking so long. How about way in the back?
Hi, two-part question. One, you were at the Academy Awards, so is Leonardo DiCaprio as beautiful a person as he is in the film?
I wasn't close enough to what you said.
Part two, towards the end of the film, when you're doing the editing and final publication, you talk about putting the URL at the end of the story, and the internet was kind of primitive still around that time. How do you think the story reporting would have changed if the story was reported today?
Well, I'll give you a two-part answer to that. One is, I think our investigation was I think it was the first to go viral because of the internet. We published the internal church documents with our stories, and it did two things. One, it showed people that our stories were for real. And I think it's one of the reasons we didn't have much blowback. We didn't get much criticism, even from devout Catholics, because we showed that this was not just an opinion piece. This was a story based on the internal church documents. It was irrefutable. It was nailed to the ground. There was no argument that could be made. That said, today our reporting would be different. I mean, there's this wonderful scene in the movie where you see us constructing this database of suspect priests. And, we're reading the names of the priests to one another, and we're putting them all in a spreadsheet, which I guess at that time felt somewhat sophisticated. But today, we would just feed all those pages, we would just scan everything. And instead of struggling for 3.5 weeks to build a database, we would scan everything, and probably in 2 or 3 days, instead of 2 or 3 weeks, we'd have a searchable database that would be a much more efficient tool. It's much easier to find people today than it used to be. So I think our investigation might have gone more quickly if we were to do it today as opposed to 2001, just because of all the wonderful tools we have because of the internet. That's why the internet for us is a double-edged sword. It's destroyed the business model for news organizations. I mean, literally destroyed it. But on the other hand, we have some terrific tools that help us do investigative reporting, access to databases, for instance. It's fantastic.